Having discussed issues about journalist responsibilities, this panel is going to take up the issue of what news consumers might be expected to do, what their responsibilities are. And so we have three people who have really great experiences and insights on how to encourage that and teach it. Before we get into that, I just would like to, by way of introducing this topic, propose the notion that instead of merely categorizing true information and false information, or truth and falsity, or even on a scale of falsity from slightly false to pants on fire, we also might think about how to disambiguate different forms so that we're not necessarily concerning ourselves with things that are not in the larger scheme of things in our hands to deal with, or that we don't really need to bother with, so that we can get on to the bigger issues. There certainly is a huge range of projects dealing with this. It's become kind of a cottage industry. Again, soon you will hear from the best of projects on this. But let me just propose that, again, we should try to think about which of these things can be ameliorated with news literacy projects and which maybe cannot. So we have disinformation by imposters, either from the United States, or increasingly we see impersonations of news outlets by foreign powers, not state actors, but still foreign powers, foreign agents who are planting stories, planting ads, doing all kinds of nefarious things. Again, we can ask the question, how much is news literacy going to deal with that? Advertorial content, clickbait, wholly fabricated stories that might seem to a normal consumer to be outrageous, but who's normal these days? Certainly not me. Laughably extreme tweets that really aren't about fake news, but just things that he doesn't like, speaking of our president. Trolls with a political agenda, getting increasingly sophisticated. Baseless and irrelevant denunciations of fake news. Rumors and speculations that sometimes are clearly presented as rumors, but actually are based on facts, but then because it started out as a speculation are denied, and then weeks later turn out to be true. Deliberately and sort of arguably predatory exaggerations, sometimes minor errors that get made by other people into really big things, and in fact are not only minor errors but are apologized for by the news outlets, as well as substantive claims that really are errors by journalists that then have to be walked back for whatever reason. So hyper-partisan content, satirical sources, won't show you the bottom of that slide. Sort of making a distinction between a good faith hoax and a bad faith hoax. So again, presumably all of this matters, but some of these forms may matter more than others. So first we're going to hear from Dan Russell, the Senior Research Scientist for Search Quality and User Happiness. I definitely commend you to his websites for the wonderful things he teaches about search and research. Then we'll hear from Alan Miller, the CEO of the News Literacy Project, a prize winner of all kinds. He has a Pulitzer Prize, a George Polk Award, a Goldsmith Prize for investigative reporting, among many other honors. And then third, we will have Jevin West, who directs the data lab at UW, that is University of Washington, has actually a background in biology as well as professional interests in skiing and tennis. So this is something to look forward to.
So I just got here, literally 5 minutes ago. Just before we went on stage, I got mic'd and I'm here. So I'm late. Not as in the late Dan Russell, but as in running late. And if you know anything about traffic here, I'm also a miracle worker because I got here an hour ago. And so I made it through 495 traffic and I made it here. So I'm very happy to be here. But I want to basically start by talking about what I do, because as was just mentioned, is I do run a blog and I do a lot of teaching. I teach people how to search, and I teach journalists how to search more efficiently. In fact, tomorrow afternoon, if you've got some time, I'll be teaching a course on this. We'll be doing an hour-long session. But one of the things I find so interesting is the way in which my news, media, literacy, education practices have changed over the past couple of years. Once upon a time, I would teach you how to use file type : or how to use minus, or how to craft exactly the right query. Now, well, let me tell you a story to set the stage. I work at Google, and as you know, Google's got fantastic cafes. We don't call them cafeterias, they're cafes. And one is on a street near where my office is, called Pear Avenue. And as a consequence, it's the Pear Building, like the fruit, pear. Right? So the cafe there is called the Pear Republic. Now, if you know the flag of California, we are also known as the Bear Flag State, the Bear Flag Republic. And so in that cafe, there is a poster, or a mural rather, about the length of that wall. Imagine a mural that tells a story about the flag of California. So the cafe is called the Pear Republic Cafe. And the poster mural on the wall tells the story of how the flag of California with its bear is actually a giant mistake. Turns out, the story and the presented in the mural says that the flag was actually originally supposed to be a pear, not a bear, but it was misread by the guy who drew the flag. And you might wonder, why a pear? Because the captain, and this is true, by the way, at least parts of it, the captain of the militia in Sonoma at the time of the, shall we say, enforced secession, was Josiah Bartlett. And he wanted it to be a pear because he wanted it to reflect the agricultural richness of California. So he writes a note, draw pear on flag. Mary Todd Lincoln's nephew gets this note, and he's in a hurry or he's drunk or something. He misreads that, and so he draws a bear on the flag. And this is the story that's told in the mural. Okay? I thought, really? Really? So I looked it up, and I dug a little bit, and I did what you do. I do fact checking, and I thought, yeah, it's BS, right? Okay. I wonder how many people buy this story. They see it on the wall, right? It's a little bit like in 1984. We have always been at war with East Asia, posters everywhere. Do people believe this? And so there was an opportunity for me to do a natural study, because in the normal course of events, people move around. And it turns out that entire building was emptied and replaced with all new people. Just reorg. So all these new people had never seen this sign before. And so I went to the cafe, and I spent a lovely few days asking people, is that true? Do you believe that? If so, why? You see where I'm going with this, right? 75% of the 50 Googlers I interviewed, 75% said, oh, of course it's true. It's on the wall at Google. It must be true. Okay. Did you search for it? Did you do a check? Why would I? Okay, this is an important point. Why would I? It doesn't conflict with anything I know. Seems fun. It's a cute story. It's attractively done. Looks like it was done by a professional. Great. It must be true. So I asked a bunch of those folks if they would then search for it. Okay. Now, keep in mind, 25% of people thought it was either I don't know, or 10% actually said it's not true. So we have a vanishingly small minority of people who actually figured it out. What happened to the 75%? So I asked a bunch of them, could you search it out? And they would pull out their phone and do Prayer Flag Republic. They would search for it. The first hit, I guarantee it, is a Snopes article on, is the flag of California supposed to be a pear? It's the first article. And they would dutifully click on that. It's Snopes, right? Say, yes, it's true. So I read that, and being sort of a natural fact checker, I said, really? And so I read the whole damn article, which is basically repeating the story. In fact, much of the text on the wall has been researched from / plagiarized from that article, right? So it looks really familiar. Oh yeah, it's exactly right. Must be right. If you get to the very, I'd encourage you to do this in your spare time. When you get to the very last line of the Snopes article, it says, click here for background information. You click on that link, and it takes you to an article that says, don't believe everything you read, including stuff at Snopes. Okay? Why did less than 25% of people who work at Google read that bottom line? It is literally the bottom line of this story. Why did 75% of them not think to fact check this? Or of the people I watched fact checking it, why did they do such a bad job? This tells us something really deep, and it tells you about what's changed in my teaching practice over the past few years. I still teach you how to do stuff, how to use Google Earth, how to use Street View, how to do all these things. But increasingly, I've started to shift towards teaching an attitude. An attitude where you question stuff. And you can't question everything because, why is the sky blue? It takes too much time. You have to figure out what to judiciously question and where to spend your time. So we know from studies that we've done at Google that people spend on average, even for questions that they're interested in, like what is mesothelioma? They will spend less than 7 minutes researching that. And for a complex topic like the Prayer Flag Republic, 7 minutes is barely enough. So I've been teaching an attitude of questioning, of even asking questions and verifying things you think you know are true. Here's a test question. This is a vocabulary test for journalists, okay? How many people believe that the word, let's choose a good word here, to peruse. When you peruse something, do you scan it and read it quickly? Okay. How many people believe it's to read carefully in depth? Okay, 99% of you are not voting, which tells me something. So you're in the fuzzy, mushy middle. You don't know, right? It means to read carefully, to read with great attention to detail. But you don't look it up. Why not? You didn't really know what it meant. Right? So these are just like the people in the Prayer Flag Republic Cafe. So I've been trying to teach that not only is the price of liberty eternal vigilance, but the entry to reading news, the entry to reading anything in the modern world is eternal vigilance and asking questions. So I've been trying to teach my students this attitude. It's a little bit of an in-your-face attitude. When in doubt, search it out. I don't mean to sound like Jesse Jackson, but it's the right thing to do. You should be checking these things, even for things you think you know. So I think that's one shift that's happened for me in teaching the past few years. Yes, I can teach you the mechanics, but I need to give you the underlying attitude, the underlying belief that you should be checking all this stuff. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Back in the summer of 2016, David Brooks wrote in the New York Times, "When facts become unmoored, everything becomes unmoored." Those words proved to be deeply prescient. In the disorienting 15 months since that time, let's look at what has happened. In the wake of the presidential election, we learned about just how pervasive and pernicious so-called fake news is on our civic and online discourse. A month later, a North Carolina man acting on an online conspiracy theory walked into a Washington restaurant and fired 3 shots before he was apprehended in a near tragic incident that became known as Pizzagate. A month later, we had the advent of alternative facts. And now we learn on almost a weekly basis more information about the massive and sophisticated Russian disinformation campaign intended to sow discord in the American public and influence the outcome of the presidential election. This all represents one of the great challenges of our time, really equivalent to a public health epidemic. So-called fake news, misinformation, and disinformation are damaging to democracy and dangerous to the health of its citizens. News literacy is an effort to inoculate the next generation and the public in general from this growing plague. Oops. We at the News Literacy Project work with educators and journalists to teach students how to know what to believe in a digital age and to give them the tools to be engaged and informed citizens in a democracy. We teach them that all information is not created equal, and we give them an appreciation of the First Amendment and the role of a free press. In the process, we teach them to think like journalists, because in an information age, everybody is their own editor and everybody can be their own publisher. So how does the next generation play those roles in ways that are responsible and credible and empower their voices? We want our students to ask these questions about any news or information they encounter. Can I trust this? Should I share this? Should I act on it? We have a very big ambition. We want to see news literacy embedded in the American educational experience, inside the classroom and outside. We feel like we're teaching a new literacy for the 21st century, really a survival skill in an information age. We think this is vital for 3 reasons. First of all, we're reaching students where they live, which is on their devices, and giving them the tools to navigate this very fraught information landscape. Second, we think it's essential for the future survival of quality journalism, because without an appreciation for it, there will not be a demand for it, never mind a public willing to pay for it. And finally, most important, it's really essential for the health of the country's democracy, which is founded on the bedrock of an informed citizenry. We're doing this with a number of partners. There are 34 news organizations that are working with us, and we're beginning to work with social media companies as well. We started initially with a high-touch classroom and after-school program working in diverse and dynamic middle schools and high schools in New York, Chicago, the DC region, and Houston, working with teachers, by the way, across a broad array of subject matters: social studies, history, government, English, humanities, and journalism. We also brought in journalists to do lessons in person and virtually. We've got over 400 journalists enrolled in our online directory who collectively delivered over 750 lessons during the course of our first 8 years, when we reached about 25,000 students. But that's a very small number in a country where there are more than 27 million students enrolled in public secondary schools alone. So building on our initial success in the classroom, we devised a virtual classroom. We call it Checkology. We want to create a next generations that checks things out. We have journalists and other subject matter experts as virtual teachers throughout the lessons. We introduce students to basic concepts, but then they really learn by doing. So they learn how journalists filter news and information to decide what is news, and then they play the role of an editor and decide what stories to put on their homepage and the lead and the off lead. They learn about the First Amendment, and then they are given landmark cases involving speech and press and have to decide whether they're covered and reflect on them. They learn about the standards of quality journalism, which we use as an aspirational yardstick against which to measure all news and information, and then they're thrown into a breaking news story as a rookie reporter, and they have to interview eyewitness sources, official sources, expert sources, get documents, and tweet. We have a great deal of assessment built into the platform. It's very flexible. Teachers can do it one-to-many, projected on a smart board, or each student can have a login and do it one-to-one with self-pacing and remediation. I'm very pleased to say we launched the platform in May of 2016, and it has basically gone viral worldwide. As of this week, we have over 8,500 educators who have registered to use it in every state in the US, red and blue, urban and rural areas, and 65 countries, actually it's now 67 countries around the world. And the teachers who have registered teach over 1.3 million students. This gives you a sense of sort of the global reach. You can see all the dots in the US where we've got very heavy penetration everywhere. And we've reached interestingly, some surprising countries. There are a number of educators who are using it in China and in Hungary. We even have an educator in Macedonia, from which so much of the fake news originated, who's registered to use the platform. We know we're having impact because we do a lot of assessment, measuring changes in students' knowledge, attitudes, and behavior. Students who do any of our programs immediately begin to consume more news. They gain a greater appreciation of the role of the First Amendment, a free press, and a democracy. 80 to 90% say they are better able to both discern and create credible information. And a half to two-thirds say they're more likely to vote in elections when they're old enough to do so. We also know that our programs can be transformative in terms of anecdotal experience. Christian Armstrong was a student in Chicago who was really disengaged from the news. After doing news literacy, he was tweeting with a correspondent, a columnist for the Chicago Tribune, debating news stories in his classroom. And you can see this quote where he said, "This class has definitely changed my life. We prioritize news literacy over all else. The newspaper is considered to be our holy grail." We have a similar comment from a student in Washington who talked about having learned to control the news we consume instead of allowing the news we consume to control us. We have come a long way. We feel in many ways we've gone from being a voice in the wilderness to an answer to a prayer for many, but we have a long way to go. We're already contemplating Checkology 2.0, an even more robust and engaging platform. We want to create a Spanish language version and more international resources. We plan to create a mobile app that will supplement what we've done with Checkology and reach students and the general public outside of the classroom. We're now doing a weekly newsletter called The Sift, which turns that week's viral rumors, hoaxes, and conspiracy theories into teachable moments with discussion prompts and other material for the classroom. And we're building out the capacity to be able to do more of this for both students and the general public. So we're looking for new participants, new partners, new patrons, and I would invite all of you here to join us. And if you want to see me to discuss how you might do so, to strike a blow for the next generation, for quality journalism, and for the health of our country's democracy, I invite you to join our cause and to give facts a fighting chance. Thank you.
Great stuff. Let's see, just click this here. Wrong button. There we go. I'm pushing all the right buttons, I think, but okay. Pressing red. Okay, green. I'm trying them all. Maybe at the same time. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. All right, so in January of this year, January 11th, my colleague and I, Carl Bergstrom at the University of Washington, we'd kind of been getting fed up with the kind of BS that we'd seen in our professional world. So we're both scientists. We both come from the biological sciences. I sort of teach classes in data science and machine learning now. in the information school. But we decided to put out a website. It broke all the university rules. We were supposed to get approval first from the university, and we said, let's just put this up. We woke up the next morning and we had tens of thousands of people from all over the world, and it's grown, and it has sort of gone viral in some respects. Just within 6 months, we now have been contacted by more than 60 universities around the country and around the world to adopt this kind of content. But we're really excited about addressing or working with high school students. In fact, today I'm going to be on a call talking to a classroom on Skype using some techniques that we teach in the class. One of the things I want to mention, though, is that for us, our focus is on the data side. It's on, in this world of big data, we're inundated with ways of quantifying the world, and we see as much problem in that kind of argument as we see in language and rhetoric. So in fact, numbers, I think, carry this veneer of authority that we're trying to change a little bit. So one of the most important principles in the bullshit studies is, I think, this, it was well stated by Brandolini, this asymmetry principle, which is the amount of energy to refute BS is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. So it's easy to create, but hard to clean up. And so we should always keep that in mind, why we need to sort of fix this problem today. As Alan was mentioning, this sort of really caught our attention and the effects that fake news can have. But even after it had been refuted, even after the promulgators of this kind of information apologized, like Alex Jones, earlier this year, after all of this, there were still protests on the White House lawn claiming that the conspiracy was even bigger with all these apologies. So this principle, Brandolini's principle, really comes back. We see it a lot in science, of course, around vaccinations. That's a real, an especially big problem. I don't have time, but I could talk ad nauseum about that. So these are the kinds of things that we try to hit in our class, because we have tons and tons of content. When you teach a class on BS, you have infinite content to pull from. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what to focus on. What I was thinking about today is just to give you a few samples, in its simplest form, that maybe the producers of the story, so the journalists, this may be somewhat helpful. Of course, you can go to 50 hours of lectures that we have, and you can find some of the lectures online in video format and in other forms. But I'm just going to go through. I'm going to talk a little bit about one thing that many journalists probably aren't as familiar with, and that's the crisis, the fake news crisis in science right now, which is a big concern for me. So one of the things that one of our sort of central philosophies in this class is that this inundation with data, people are scared of the black box. A lot of us don't have PhDs in computer science or statistics, so when we see a multinomial regression or a Bonferroni correction or some p-value, we get nervous. And we sort of think that, well, it must be true because it has that fancy term on there. It's a bit how we use jargon to sort of impress our colleagues. So we want to deconstruct that. And our goal in this class is to teach the general public, college students, of course, freshmen is our kind of main target, and journalists and librarians on how to not be intimidated by that black box, that algorithm, that fancy machine computer vision algorithm that was just reported on. So there are three things I'm just going to go through real quick just to have a little bit of fun. So first of all, be careful with head stories, and I'll tell you what I mean by head stories. Be honest with graphs. Those are one of the first things you can do just to fix some of the problems that I see literally on a daily basis. I find it in the best newspapers and in the best journals every single day. And be wary of these predatory journals. And I think that's something that may not be something that receives enough focus, I don't think, at least when it regards science. Some of you may have seen this particular headline. So, 70% of Facebook users only read the headline of science stories before commenting. And if you look at the number of shares on there, it was 60,000 shares. This was at the time of the snapshot. It grew much bigger. But if you actually clicked on the story, you'd find that it was random text. It was lorem ipsum. So in my field of computer science, this is something we use as fillers to build structured forms. And so it was random text, and people were sharing this because it sort of filled their narrative. And so the idea here is that even after a story on the fact that people don't dig into the reading, they still share it. So as journalists, I mean, I think you are aware of this, but because of that, we have to be careful on how we sort of layer our headlines. let me explain a little bit more. So this is an example. This was a tweet that NBC News tweeted out during the discussions around the immigration policy earlier this year. And it said that international student applications in American schools were down nearly 40%. If you look at the retweets, again, this is just only at the time of the screen capture. But this was retweeted many, many times. It was eventually taken down because of this issue, because my colleague and I wanted to see that. One of the things we teach in our class is we say, if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is, or something too bad to be true, it probably is. So if you look at the actual article that this tweet was based on, it wasn't that applications were down 40%. If you see highlighted, it was down. They were down at nearly 40% of the schools, which is a much different story than being down at 40%. And even worse, if you go to the actual research article on this particular story, something we teach, really try to teach students to do, to create this habit of mind of going into your source, you find that it was down at around 40% of the universities, but it was actually up at 35% of the other universities. So that's a totally different story than the original tweet. So we have to be careful with these headlines. And this is something I know journalists have been hearing since the beginning of journalism. But I think it's even more important today because even though we want people to dig to the stories, just like that initial story about 70% of Facebook readers don't read beyond the headline, we have to be careful of that. The chart has been rising in newspapers. This is a chart showing the number of, just counting the number of charts in the New York Times over a particular time period. And this is evident in all sorts of newspapers. This is, of course, predominant in science. We've been doing this, all the fields of science, sociology, psychology, social sciences, of course, the STEM sciences, everything is quantified now. You get beautiful work that's being done at places like New York Times, and not all newspapers and organizations have the kind of budget to host a 30-person team to do just information visualization. But because of that, and because I don't think there's been enough training in how to convey ideas through graphs and figures and other kinds of graphical storytelling, we have to be careful with that. So it's one thing, of course, I can only show 2 seconds worth of this, but it's something that we feel strongly about that at least we can improve in this area of storytelling because it's really easy to manipulate. So here's an example. Maybe some of you have seen some of these examples from slides that we put all our stuff online. If you look at this particular story, this was a story looking at the effect of this law, the Stand Your Ground law in Florida in 2005. And it looks at the gun deaths in Florida. And if you look closely, does anyone see a problem with that? It's upside down. That was a simple thing. The axes go from 0 to 800. So what looks like a law that actually reduced gun deaths. Now, you can make your own conclusions on whether there's a causal explanation for this. But if the story was Florida Stand Your Ground law enacted in 2005 and look at the chart go down, you just see this quickly because we don't have as much attention for things anymore. We sweep through things that land in our feeds. This would be completely misleading. Now, this particular example, the author was given a lot of flack for this, and she did apologize. And I actually think that she wasn't trying to be nefarious here. I think that she just was trying to make the graphic look like blood coming down off the screen. But we have to be careful with the way we tell stories with graphs. So this is probably the easiest thing we can do is make sure that we're not misleading with that fancy, or with the y-axis. This is one of my favorite graphs. I don't know where the source is on this one, but I thought it was so great. You can't see the numbers here, but well, you can actually. The 99%, so it looks like about is truncating axis misleading, half say yes, half say no, when in fact, of course, the majority say yes. But this happens, this simple thing happens all the time. And there's something we call we, and Carl and I call the principle of proportional ink. So in this case, if you're going to tell a story with bar graphs, it's really untelling. If you're telling a story about trust, this was a real story about trust between those in Quebec and rest of Canada. I mean, it looks quite different. If you look on the left, you have a little bit of blue and lots of red. If you added up the pixels of red and the pixels of blue, it's certainly a lot more than what you'd find in just 36.44 and 58.2. But this happens again all the time. This is another story that was showing the difference in the number of hours around the European countries, and the Germans were highlighted here as 14.4, and those lazy French people at the bottom of the chart were at 37.4. But if you look at it with it in a proper way, there's a whole different story being told. So these are obviously really simple things. Now we have tons of more complicated things, but it's this simple cleanup. One of the more famous articles on climate change came out in the National Review and says, look at the climate over the last many decades. Flat line, right? No change in temperature. Now here's one situation where you don't have to zoom in because it's not a proportional ink problem, because line graphs are much different than pie charts. And so the story here is you're not cheating here with zooming in. And there was a great, what we call reductio ad absurdum. This is a technique we teach to students on refutation. This was one of my favorite refutations of this particular graph, which was done by Bloomberg, that showed if you put time on the x-axis and time on the y-axis, and you zoom out far enough, you can prove that time doesn't really march forward. So you can see here. So you can do everything. You can do everything with graphs. So the last thing I want to end up with real quick is just one thing that it doesn't get enough attention. I've been speaking to science journalists locally in the Seattle area and on the West Coast about this is a problem. This is a major problem in science. Just to give you some numbers, in 2014, there was about $75 million garnered by predatory journals. Predatory journals you can basically assume that they have zero peer review and they will take and accept everything. 500,000 approximately, so about 500,000 articles have been injected into the scientific literature that were just straight from predatory journals. And if we as journalists, I'm sort of trying to be a part of this community, if we're citing that and we're not careful about how to detect legitimate articles, this is a very big problem. And it is a crisis in science right now, if you haven't been paying attention. I live in this world, I study scholarly communication, and it's something that doesn't get enough attention. Let me give you one example. This was an article that was written in what looks to be a real scientific article. It's got fancy jargon, atomic energy, single source. It's got the International Conference on Atomic and Nuclear Physics. But let me tell you a little bit about the history of this story. It was put together by Christopher Bartneck at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand. But it was written by his autocomplete application in his phone. So if I was to go back and you read the abstract, atomic physics and I shall not have the same problem with a separate section for a very long, long way. Nuclear weapons will not have come out of the same day after a long time. It was published and accepted in this journal. That's only one of thousands of examples. This was just a point to demonstrate how easy it is to get into these predatory journals and look sciencey. So we need to be careful of this. This is not something that's getting, I don't think, enough attention around the fake news epidemic in general. There's a real problem in science. And also, the claims, one thing to keep in mind, need to be commensurate with the venue. Not to say that everything that goes in nature is good, because I can promise you it's not. But if the West Tennessee Journal of Bug Farming, sorry if anyone's from Tennessee, Tennessee is a great state. It's just the journal here. It's a fake journal here. If they're claiming that they found a new protein in some bug that cures cancer, you might want to question it a little bit. Now, if they're saying that they did some natural history and sort of were studying these kinds of bugs, that's another thing. So those are the kinds of, there's tons of tips we have. You can look for these things. I think we can make this a lot of fun. The students, when we had the class, it signed up within a minute from 40 majors across campus. We're working with, actually now it's more global, working with thousands of different students. So if you can think of ways to engage these students, I would love to do that. The last thing I would say, we teach the simplest thing you can learn if you took nothing else from the slides are 2 slides. Always ask who is telling me this, how they know it, and what's in it for them. This is something we tell students, and surprisingly, it can be world-changing for them for strange reasons. And then the other big thing that I've already mentioned so far is if a claim seems too good to be true or bad, it probably is. So with that, you can follow us. We send out examples almost on a daily basis that we find at our @CallAndBowl tweet. I spend more time on that one than my own personal tweets. So if you want to follow us, you can. We also have callingbullshit.org and callingbull.org if you don't like the swear words. That's geared towards our high school students. So thanks.